You're listening to Unmuted with Papamutes.
And it kind of became, as he got older, he started to do more and more like advocacy work and public speakings about what was happening in the prison systems in the US and why it needed to change. And that led Chesa to becoming a public defender. And then ultimately, he decided to run for district attorney in San Francisco. And that's kind of where the film picks up, is that it goes through his journey of becoming district attorney and then what
Yeah, I
happened
mean,
afterwards.
it's well put together. I mean, obviously, you want the film to grab your interest, and I don't know who the editors were, but it's good. It's great. I mean, I watch a lot of films, whether it's documentaries or Hollywood or whatever, and it's the way they put it together and told the story. It keeps your interest. You know, it's like I don't know, how do I feel about this? You know, back and forth. I'm like, but I'm like, but I didn't catch. So a couple of armored truck people died, correct? Is that what
Yes.
happened? But they
Yes.
didn't say, or maybe I missed, who actually killed them. You know what I mean?
So the robbery in 1981, it was a Brinks truck, and I guess not everybody knows what the Brinks trucks are. Those are essentially the trucks with cash from like retail establishments, essentially. And
Hmm.
the the
It's the
people
truck that brings my paycheck every week.
exactly. uh, and so it was members of the Black Liberation Army were the ones who committed the robbery itself, and then
Hmm.
members of the Weather Underground were they were the getaway drivers. So that was Kathy Boudin and David Gilbert. They were getaway drivers for what had happened, and it was
Okay.
actually members of the Black Liberation Army who killed the two officers and the guard. It was one of the guards of the Brinks truck who died as well. And
Okay.
it, according to everything that David and Kathy had said, is like that was never part of the plan. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. They didn't even. She didn't even. I think. I think Kathy was very naive, and she would be the one who would say that. You know, she lived in kind of like a bit of a false reality of what she always told it as like a Robin Hood story to her son, and
Hmm.
I so I ultimately it was not them that did the murders, but it was members of the Black Liberation Army.
Guilty by association, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Being in on it. So the story, I mean, again, it's a great story because the kid was left pretty much that day, like that morning, and that was it until
Yeah.
this other couple came along. Um, but do you feel the story is trying to, and again, as I'm watching it, trying to garner up sympathy for them when really they were doing crimes? You know what I mean?
Yes. Totally. I don't think that, and I think that we had a lot of I know we had a lot of discussions about this, and we
Hmm.
didn't want to make this about sympathy for the crimes at all. And I think that the film does go into this quite a bit. That it wasn't until they started to really kind of express remorse and understand what had what they had done, that they started to move on. And it's a tough question, but I don't think we tried to make the audience sympathetic about the crimes. I think, and more importantly, we were trying to show the issues with our current justice system and the the shortcomings of it. And I think that we use Chase's family story to kind of showcase that, because ultimately they really did a lot of things. Both David and Kathy, they did a tremendous amount of really great things within prison, like for HIV and AIDS, and bringing families together, and helping people get jobs in prison. And really, they it was all about restorative justice for them. They really wanted to rehabilitate within prison, and I think that that's an important thing that prison can and should be, is a system for people to rehabilitate. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes there are cases where people can really like turn their lives around and ultimately be released from prison and become very productive members of society. And I think that that is way more important than trying to cast a sympathetic light on what they had actually done.
Fair enough. So towards the end of the film, I believe towards the end, there's some pool for. Are they? First of all, are they still alive? These people, these four
Kathy
people.
Boudin died recently, actually
Okay.
during the making of the film.
Ah,
So we actually
wow.
didn't finish some important interviews because she passed away. David
I
Gilbert is
see.
still alive. Yeah.
What about the Bill Ayers and Bernadette
Yeah.
or
Bill and Bernadine
Bernadine?
are
Sorry.
both alive as well.
Okay. All right. The question, I believe they were up for parole, right?
Yes.
And I didn't see any. And again, I'm not a film critic, but I'm just thinking from watching other, documentaries and such. Any uh, opinion from the victims' families, whether they should be paroled or not? Was there any? Did I miss that? Or
We didn't get into it in the film very much at all.
okay,
And for good reason. There's still a lot of like animosity, I'm sure.
sure,
And it's also worth noting that whenever I started working for the film, a lot of these bigger decisions on the structure and stuff had already happened. Um,
okay,
but I think one really great story that didn't make it in the film, but Chesa talked about at the panel in Los Angeles, is that uh, one of the victims, somebody who was involved in the carjacking, and I'm not going to tell the story perfectly, but one of the victims who was there, they had stolen a car, and she was part of the carjacking, and she was part of who put David Gilbert in prison. Her testimony was a huge part of why he ended up being in prison. She
okay,
actually started volunteering at the prison where Kathy Boudin was, where
wow,
and she never made it known who she was, and they forged a really great relationship and became
okay,
friends, and a lot of like very Chesa talked about it in a way that this was an example of like what restorative justice can look like, that she got more out of that like time with Kathy volunteering in the prison and learning about everything, who she was and what had happened, and more about the details of everything than their time just spent decades and decades and decades in prison.
was not paroled or was he, David?
um he it's a bit. This also happened during the making of the film, so there's a lot of wild turns and twists and
Ebb and flow,
turns
right?
throughout this. But David Gilbert was ultimately, I believe it was he was ultimately paroled, but or his sentence was commuted by the governor of New York at the time, who was leaving office. It was on his last day. He did a series of pardons, Governor Cuomo, and David
Okay,
Gilbert was one of them. As opposed to Kathy, she got out through the parole board. She had three different parole hearings, and it was on her third parole where she was released.
how much time did they do
Um,
approximately?
David was over 40 years in prison, and Kathy was over 20 years.
Is it more about put the right people? I mean, there are bad people in the world. I mean,
Of
there were
course.
no angels, but I'm just saying, put people in jail that are real bad criminals, but not the guy smoking weed on the corner. Is that
That's a big
where it
part of
comes
it.
into play?
Yes, absolutely. That's a huge part of it. It's and there are district attorneys and politicians who say this a lot better than me, and who try to make this their life's work. But I think it's the idea that there's just far too many. We incarcerate more people in the United States than anywhere else in the world by far.